April 2nd, 1988. A quiet street in Kansas City's Hyde Park neighborhood, the kind of place where nothing ever happens until it does. A body hits the ground. Hard. A young man leaping from a second-story window, fleeing for his life. But this isn't just a man, he's a survivor. Naked, bleeding, shaking with a terror so profound it's almost silent. And around his neck, a leather dog collar. Soon the emergency lines begin to scream.
Hello! I need an ambulance!
Sir, can you tell me what happened?
The voice on the other end is ripped raw by fear. It belongs to the man who jumped, Christopher Bryson. And he tells a story that at first seems impossible. A story of captivity, of unspeakable pain, of a monster living inside an ordinary American home. Police cruisers slice through the calm. They pull up to 4315 Charlotte Avenue. It's just a house, blue siding, a neat lawn, another home on another street. Nothing about it screams danger. Nothing whispers of the horror held within its walls. For the officers arriving on scene, the math doesn't add up. A man in a dog collar, claiming he was held prisoner for days, tortured. It seems too grotesque, too cinematic, too evil for a place like this. They believe they're responding to a simple assault, a violent argument perhaps, a crime they've seen 100 times before. They are wrong. They have no idea. They are about to unseal a private archive. An archive meticulously curated for years that documented one of the most disturbing collections of cruelty in American history, which leads to the central, haunting question of our story. How does a man turn his home into a private museum of torture? And how does he do it for years, completely hidden in plain sight? To understand the monster, you first have to understand the man. Before the house on Charlotte Avenue became a chamber of horrors, before he was known as the Butcher of Kansas City, Robert Berdella was just Bob. If you walked through the Westport neighborhood in the 1980s, you'd probably know his shop, Bob's Bizarre Bazaar, a local fixture. It was a place filled with oddities and curiosities, a reflection of the man himself. Bob was the neighborhood eccentric, highly intelligent, a talented cook, a man who could talk for hours about art, history, and theology. He was known for his generosity, often helping out struggling artists and even serving as a block captain, organizing neighborhood watch programs to keep people safe. He wore thick glasses. He was overweight. He was unassuming. To the world, Bob Berdella was the harmless oddball, a man who collected strange things, but was ultimately a part of the community's fabric. A man you might know, you might even like. But behind that carefully constructed facade, behind the friendly chatter and the quirky storefront, a different kind of collection was being planned. A collection that had been in the making for a very, very long time. To find the real Robert Berdella, you have to go back. Back to the beginning. Born in 1949 in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio, his father was a tool and die maker, a hard-working man. His mother, a devout Catholic. From the outside, it was a typical post-war American family. But inside the home, young Robert felt like an outsider. He was a brilliant child, with an IQ that placed him in the genius category. But that intelligence was a double-edged sword. It set him apart, made him feel isolated. While other boys were playing sports, Robert was lost in books, in his own head. He was a lonely kid, awkward, grappling with feelings he couldn't understand, especially his emerging homosexuality, something that was deeply taboo in the deeply religious environment of the 1950s. He felt like a secret, walking in a world that wouldn't accept him if they knew the truth. And in that isolation, in that secret world he built for himself, dark seeds began to take root. It started, as it so often does, with the powerless, small animals. He would capture them, dissect them. It wasn't just childish curiosity. It was a fascination with anatomy, with power, with the mechanics of life and death, a desire to see how things worked from the inside. This wasn't just a phase, it was a rehearsal. Then at 16, he found his Bible. Not in a church, but in a movie theater. The film was called The Collector. Released in 1965, it tells the story of a lonely, repressed man who kidnaps a young art student. He doesn't want to hurt her, not at first. He just wants to keep her, to add her to his collection of beautiful things like a butterfly pinned to a board. He holds her captive in his basement, convinced that if he can just make her see the world his way, she will eventually learn to love him. For most people, it was a chilling work of fiction, a psychological thriller. For Robert Berdella, it was an instruction manual. He saw himself in the main character, the loneliness, the feeling of being an outsider, the obsessive desire to possess another human being completely. The film didn't just entertain him, it gave his dark fantasies a narrative. It gave him a script. He would watch it again and again and again, studying it, internalizing it. The movie became more than a movie. It became a blueprint for the man he was going to become. The idea of collecting people wasn't just a fantasy anymore. It was now a goal. This is the key to understanding the horror that would later unfold. Berdella's motive was not simply murder. That was just the final step in a much more elaborate process. His motive was the pursuit of total, absolute domination. It was a sadistic fantasy, born from a lifetime of feeling powerless, of transforming living, breathing human beings into objects for his collection. Objects to be controlled, to be catalogued, and ultimately to be discarded when he was done with them. He wanted to be the curator of his own private world, a world where he made all the rules, a world where no one could ever leave him. The friendly man in the Bizarre Bazaar was just a character he played. The real Berdella, the one who was taking notes from a movie thriller, was just waiting for the right time to start his collection, and Kansas City would become his hunting ground. The acquisition process was a study in predatory patience. Berdella was a fixture in his community, and he used this to his advantage. He knew the streets, he knew the faces, and he knew who was vulnerable. He targeted young men, often drifters, runaways, or those working as prostitutes. Men on the fringes of society, men he believed wouldn't be missed. His method was deceptively simple. He would offer them a meal, a place to stay, or a small amount of money. To these young men, often desperate and alone, Bob Berdella must have seemed like a kind, if eccentric, savior. He was older, intelligent, and offered a safe haven from the harsh realities of the street. It was a mask of compassion, expertly worn, and it worked. Once they were inside the blue house on Charlotte Avenue, the door would lock, and the real Bob Berdella would emerge. The first step in his curation process was subjugation, absolute and total control. Berdella was not a physically imposing man, so he relied on his intellect and a disturbing knowledge of pharmacology. He would lace his victims' food or drinks with powerful sedatives and tranquilizers. Sometimes he'd offer them what he claimed were recreational drugs, only to have them be potent concoctions designed to render them helpless. As the drugs took hold, the world would begin to melt away for his victims. Confusion would turn to panic, then to a terrifying drug-induced paralysis. They were awake, aware, but unable to move, unable to fight back. They were now his, and the next phase of the process would begin. This is where the fantasy of the collector twisted into a reality far more depraved. This was not about love or companionship. This was about power. And for Berdella, the ultimate expression of power was through torture. He would restrain his victims to his bed. They were now subjects in his own private, perverse experiment. He wanted to study them, to understand the limits of human endurance, to see how much pain a person could withstand before they broke. The acts he committed were systematic, they were calculated, and they must be called by their proper names. This was not just abuse. This was prolonged, systematic rape. This was brutal, methodical assault. This was, by every definition of the word, torture. He used a horrifying array of tools: electrical shocks, needles, vices. He would inflict unimaginable pain, then nurse his victims back to a state of semi-health, only to begin the process all over again. He was testing their bodies, yes, but he was also testing their minds. He wanted to erase their identities, to break their spirits so completely that they would cease to be human in his eyes. They would become nothing more than objects, his objects. And like any diligent curator, he documented everything. This is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire case: the meticulous, almost scientific way Berdella chronicled his atrocities. He kept what are now known as his torture logs. In a neat cursive script, he recorded the dates, the times, the dosages of drugs administered, and the responses of his victims. He noted their cries of pain, their moments of lucidity, their final breaths. These were not the ramblings of a madman. They were the cold, detached laboratory notes of a man who saw human suffering as data to be collected. Alongside the logs, he used a Polaroid camera. He took hundreds of photographs, images that captured every stage of his process, from the initial drugging to the final moments of his victims' lives. These were not just trophies. They were his research, his proof. He was creating a complete, detailed record of his work. Like any diligent curator, Berdella documented every detail. These were not random acts of violence. They were catalogued entries in an archive of suffering. He was building a legacy of pain, one Polaroid, one log entry at a time. This cycle of torture could last for days, sometimes even weeks, but it always had the same conclusion. Eventually, the experiment would end, and the final stage of the curation process would begin. Murder was the inevitable outcome. Sometimes it was intentional, an overdose of sedatives to end the experiment. Sometimes it was the result of the relentless torture, the human body simply giving up. But for Berdella, death was not the end. It was merely a transition. Now he was faced with a practical problem: how to dispose of the evidence. And he approached this problem with the same methodical, detached precision he applied to everything else. He was a skilled butcher. He would dismember the bodies in his bathtub, a gruesome and laborious process that he repeated again and again. He would then package the remains and dispose of them, often in his own backyard or with the weekly trash, hidden among the mundane refuse of suburban life. But he always kept a part of them, trophies for his collection. After meticulously cleaning the flesh from their heads, he would keep the skulls. Sometimes he would hide them in his house. Other times it's believed he may have even sold them in his own shop, Bob's Bizarre Bazaar, disguised as medical or anthropological novelties. The ultimate act of depravity, turning the remains of his victims into items for sale, hiding the evidence of his crimes in plain sight, right under the noses of his customers. From the first friendly conversation on the street to the final horrific act of disposal, this was Berdella's methodology. A complete, repeatable, and horrifyingly efficient system for the acquisition, documentation, and destruction of human life. The Blue House on Charlotte Avenue had become a factory of death, and for 4 long silent years the curator was left to his work, completely undisturbed. The collection was growing, and no one, it seemed, was ever going to find out. The first to be added to Berdella's collection was Jerry Howell. He was just 19 years old, young, ambitious, and trying to find his place in the world. He'd recently moved to Kansas City, a city full of promise, and had found a job he loved at a local restaurant. He was known for his infectious smile and his easygoing nature. Friends described him as the kind of person who could make anyone feel at ease. In the summer of 1984, Jerry found himself in a tough spot. He needed a place to stay, a temporary refuge while he got on his feet. Robert Berdella, a man he'd met through a mutual acquaintance, offered him a room. It was a lifeline, a gesture of kindness from a man who seemed to understand. On July 5, 1984, Jerry Howell walked into the house on Charlotte Avenue. He would never walk out. For days, Berdella subjected him to a hell that is impossible to fully comprehend. And when it was over, Jerry Howell, the young man with the infectious smile, was gone. Next was Robert Sheldon. He was older, 23, and a familiar face in the Kansas City nightlife scene. He was a wanderer, a free spirit who moved between cities, always looking for the next adventure. He'd been in and out of trouble, but he had a good heart. He was a survivor, a man who knew how to navigate the complexities of life on the margins. In the spring of 1985, his path crossed with Robert Berdella's. Berdella offered him a place to crash, a safe harbor in the storm of his nomadic life. But the harbor was a trap. Inside the Blue House, Robert Sheldon, the free spirit, found himself in chains. His resilience was tested in ways that defy description. His will to survive was pushed to its absolute limit. And in the end, his journey came to a brutal and tragic end. Then came Mark Wallace. He was just 20 years old, a young man with a bright future. He was a student, a hard worker, and a beloved son. He had a passion for music and a talent for making people laugh. He was the kind of person who lit up a room. In the summer of 1985, Mark found himself in a vulnerable position. He'd lost his job and was struggling to make ends meet. He was a regular at the Westport Flea Market, a place where Robert Berdella was a well-known figure. Berdella, ever the predator, saw an opportunity. He offered Mark a job, a chance to get back on his feet. It was a lifeline, a gesture of friendship from a man who seemed to care. Mark Wallace trusted him. He went to Berdella's house to discuss the job. It was a meeting that would seal his fate. The young man with a passion for music was silenced forever. A year later, in the summer of 1986, James Ferris became the fourth victim. He was 25 years old, a man with a kind soul and a gentle spirit. He was a drifter, a man who had fallen on hard times. He was looking for a fresh start, a chance to turn his life around. He was new to Kansas City, a stranger in a strange land, and he was alone. Berdella found him, a lost soul in a city that can be unforgiving. He offered him a meal, a warm bed, a moment of respite from the cold realities of the street. It was a tempting offer, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. James Ferris accepted. He walked into the Blue House, a house that had become a place of unspeakable horror, and he too was consumed by the darkness within. The fifth victim was Todd Stoops. He was 21 years old, a young man with a rebellious streak and a heart of gold. He was a punk rocker, a musician, a man who lived life on his own terms. He was a familiar face in the Kansas City music scene, a man who was always ready with a smile and a story. He was a force of nature, a man who was full of life. In the spring of 1987, Todd found himself in a desperate situation. He needed money, and he needed it fast. He'd heard that Robert Berdella, the owner of the Bizarre Bazaar, sometimes paid for companionship. It was a risky proposition, but Todd was a gambler. He took a chance. He went to Berdella's house. The punk rocker, the force of nature, was about to meet a man who would extinguish his fire forever. The final victim was Larry Pearson. He was just 20 years old, a young man with a troubled past and a hopeful future. He'd had a difficult life, but he was determined to make something of himself. He was a fighter, a survivor, a man who refused to be defined by his circumstances. He'd recently moved to Kansas City, looking for a new beginning. He was trying to find work, to build a new life. He was a man with a dream. In the summer of 1987, his dream turned into a nightmare. He met Robert Berdella, a man who offered him a job. It was a chance, an opportunity, a way out. Larry Pearson, the fighter, walked into the Blue House, ready to start a new chapter in his life. It would be his last. 6 young men, 6 lives cut short, 6 futures erased. They were sons, brothers, friends. They were musicians, students, dreamers. They were not just names in a killer's logbook. They were human beings, each with a story, each with a life that mattered. And it is in their memory, in the telling of their stories, that we find the true horror of Robert Berdella's crimes, not just in the details of his methodology, but in the immeasurable loss of the lives he so cruelly and senselessly destroyed. The jump from the second-story window broke the silence. Christopher Bryson's desperate escape had finally, after 4 long years, breached the walls of the archive. When police took Robert Berdella into custody, the city of Kansas City braced for a familiar story. They expected the denials of a cornered predator. They expected a fight, a long and arduous path to the truth. They expected a monster who would snarl and lie and resist until the very end. They were wrong. What they got was a confession. Not just a confession, but a full, detailed, and shockingly cooperative account of every horror he had ever committed. There was no denial, no resistance, just an unnerving calm. It was as if a switch had been flipped. The game was over, the collection had been discovered, and now all that was left for the curator was to explain his work. In the cold, sterile environment of the interrogation room, Berdella transformed. He was no longer the panicked killer whose final experiment had gone wrong. He became a guide, a docent, the curator, explaining his collection to a new captive audience. He spoke of his victims not with remorse, but with a chilling, detached clarity. He corrected the detectives' details. He clarified timelines. He was, in a sense, proud of the meticulousness of his own depravity. This surreal cooperation reached its peak when he was taken back to the house on Charlotte Avenue, the crime scene. To most killers, this would be a place of defeat, a place to be avoided at all costs. To Berdella, it was his gallery, and he gave the police a tour. He walked them through the rooms, pointing out the stains on the floorboards, the modifications he'd made to the bed for restraints, the places where he stored his chemical concoctions. He showed them the drugs, the restraints, the tools. He explained his process of subjugation, torture, and murder with the same matter-of-fact tone one might use to explain a recipe. He led them to the backyard, pointing out the exact spots where he had buried the dismembered remains of his victims. He even showed them the human skull he had boiling on the stove when he was arrested, a final, grotesque trophy in the making. This was his show and tell, a final, horrifying performance. He was the only one who knew the complete catalogue of the archive, and he was now ensuring that its contents were properly understood. He was, even in his final moments of freedom, curating the narrative of his own evil. As the details began to leak, a wave of horror and revulsion washed over Kansas City. The community was reeling. The friendly, quirky owner of the Bizarre Bazaar was a monster. The quiet house on the peaceful street was a torture chamber. The public wanted justice. And to them, justice looked like a trial. They wanted to see this man on the stand. They wanted to hear the evidence, see the photographs, and understand, in a public forum, how this could have possibly happened. The prosecutor's office was faced with an immense challenge. The evidence they had was overwhelming. The Polaroids, the detailed torture logs, the human remains, and of course the full confession of the killer himself. A conviction seemed all but certain. But that same evidence was a double-edged sword. A public trial would be a media circus of unprecedented proportions. It would mean presenting the graphic, soul-crushing details of Berdella's crimes to a jury and to the world. The victims' families would have to endure a public recitation of the horrors their loved ones suffered. The city would be forced to relive the trauma, day after day. And there was always the risk, however small, of an appeal, of a legal loophole, of a technicality that could complicate the path to justice. So, the prosecution made a controversial choice. They offered Robert Berdella a deal. In exchange for a full, detailed confession to all his crimes, and in exchange for leading them to the remains of all his victims, They would take the death penalty off the table. He would plead guilty. He would be sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. He would die behind bars. Berdella agreed. For the families, it was a bitter pill to swallow. There would be no public trial, no day in court where they could confront the man who had destroyed their lives. But it was a guarantee that he would never, ever walk free again. In December of 1988, Robert Berdella pleaded guilty to 1 count of first-degree murder and later to 4 more. The archive, in a sense, was sealed again, this time by law. And this is a key reason why Robert Berdella, despite the sheer documented horror of his crimes, is not a household name like Bundy or Dahmer. There was no sensational trial broadcast across the nation. The most graphic pieces of evidence, the Polaroids and the logs, were locked away in an evidence room, their full contents never revealed to the public. The story was contained, the horror kept behind legal doors. Robert Berdella would spend the rest of his life in a concrete cell at the Missouri State Penitentiary. He showed little remorse, often complaining about his treatment in prison and even claiming that he, too, was a victim. On October 8, 1992, just 4 years after his arrest, his heart gave out. Robert Berdella, the curator of cruelty, was dead at the age of 43. But did the story die with him? The Polaroids showed faces the police could never identify. Men who were photographed in states of terror and subjugation, but whose identities remain a mystery to this day. Were they other victims who managed to escape? Or were they perhaps victims who didn't? The human skulls found in his home, did they all belong to the 6 known victims? Or does the true number of those added to his collection remain forever unknown? The archive is closed, but its full contents may never be truly known. In the end, Robert Berdella remained the ultimate curator of his own story, the quirky shop owner, the friendly neighbor, the sadistic collector. By confessing, he avoided the public scrutiny of a trial, sealing the full horror of his archive away in police evidence lockers. He is not just one of America's most disturbing killers, he is a terrifying reminder that the most monstrous collections of evil can be hidden behind the most ordinary doors, curated by a man you would never suspect.